Hi everyone, this is John from VrayForC4D, and today I'd like to share with you 5 of my favorite tricks in V-Ray for Cinema 4D. Tip number 1. This one I'd like to call the 3-camera system, and it can be applied to any render engine, not just V-Ray for Cinema 4D. So here is what it's all about. Alright, so let me show you with this scene what I mean by 3-camera system. You can see here that I have 3 cameras and each of them has their own individual purpose. The first one is for sure the most important one. I called it camera fixed because that's my final fixed render view. If I create my final render, that's the camera I'm going to use. And of course I applied a protection tag and locked everything down. If I want to work on some detail, I might be inclined to simply, deactivate that camera, do my thing, model the scene, and then hit the render button. But now I have incorrect exposure and incorrect white balance because these settings are stored with the camera. Here, white balance, film ISO. And by deactivating the camera and moving around, I essentially lost these settings, right? So it's much better if I just create a copy of this fixed camera, that's what this camera is here, and remove that protection tag. And now I can use this new camera to move around, do my modeling, hit render in between to see something up close, and everything is great, right? Well, not exactly, because there's another problem. Let me show you with this glass here. If I work on this scene and I think, yeah, I think that looks pretty good, like this, and then I accidentally might have moved that glass behind a pillar that is in front of it. But you can only see this problem from the perspective of the original camera. So that's why I need this third camera, this zoomed in camera here in the middle. This one's actually also a copy of our overall camera, but I removed the rotation lockdown and I increased my focal length to something like 300. So if I activate this camera now, I still am with this camera at the point of my main camera, and I still have the perfect perspective, but I'm zoomed in. So rendering this camera now will give me back all the detail that I need in order to make sure that this portion of the scene is modeled correctly and textured correctly and everything. So I work with these 3 cameras and switch between them back and forth and use them like this. The only problem you need to look out for with this middle camera here is that if you use depth of field, increasing your focal length will create a much shallower depth of field. And you might run into this when you do your renders from a detailed view like this. Other than that, it's really a great approach to creating detailed renders of a scene rather. Yeah, that's it. Let's move on to the next tip. Tip number 2, dirty and rusty. In this tip, I'm going to show you how you can create dirt and rust in a very efficient manner and then apply it to materials that need it. So you don't have to lose that much time in creating these damaged or aged materials. Alright, so this is what we're trying to accomplish. Here, a metal material with some rust on top of it. And it's actually fairly easy to do this. What you need to do is you need to create your metal material separate from your rust material and then combine the two in a V-Ray blend material. You can see here the compounds of this blend material. The first one is the shiny metal material that I created. And I would patch this shiny metal material into the base material slot of our blend material. And on top, I'm using this strong rust. And let's just quickly look at this strong rust material for a second. It's created by, well, of course, a diffuse material, which gives it this rusty color. A little bit of specularity, as you can see here, just a tiny little bit, not too much. And of course a bump, because rust is always bumpy, right? Because it corrodes the surface of the metal, so there needs to be bump. But the most important channel would be the material weight. Here I'm using a Burcon noise map to define where on the surface the rust will be and where it will not be. So if I remember right, black means that this material will appear, and white means it's invisible. I'm showing you the settings of this Burcon noise map, and you can, if you want to copy these settings, I don't mind. It's only important that you are aware of the settings here, the low value of 0.5 and the high value of 0.65. If you vary these by tiny amounts, you can actually control the spread of your rust. And that's exactly what I did. I created the rust mild material and the rust strong material, and these two are basically identical, except that I varied this low and high value. And that's all. So now you have it. You can create this blend material, patch in the two separate materials, and create your damaged metal material. If you like, you can also do something like I did here with this metal rusty bell material. I patched in multiple damages on top of each other, and the second one is just a moldy material. That's it for this tip. Let's move on. Tip number 3. I'm going to show you in this one how you can create absolutely fabulous looking polished wood material with the car paint shader. Alright, let me start by showing you how I think you should not approach polished wood material, and that's the example I have open right here. Well, it's a good looking wood material, but it doesn't look like polished wood material. Polished wood material actually consists of two different layers. There's this wood layer underneath, and on top a rather thick layer of lacquer coating, and this lacquer coating has a separate bump on it. Well, two separate bumps, that's not something we can do with the advanced material like the one I've opened here. We could use something like a blend material, of course, to stack different materials on top of each other. I think this would work, but it's not very efficient. It would render rather slow. So we need another solution, and you guessed it already, we can use the car paint material. And this will give us a result like this one here. Now, if you look at this, you can see that the wood underneath still retains this wood grain, and especially in the shadow transition area, there's a beautiful structure of the wood still visible. But the lacquer on top of it is very smooth and has almost no bump to it. So this also, in addition to looking good, it also renders very fast. So that's another advantage. Let's just quickly look at this polished wood shader here, and it's actually straightforward. You use your standard diffuse map, your bump map that is a little more coarse for the wood underneath it. You can see that here. And a little bit of reflection, not too much, because we're going to add some more reflection afterwards via the coating layer. And the coating layer is here. That's the lacquer, and it's very glossy, but the bump is very minuscule. I think in the video you won't be able to see any detail in this map, but here on my screen I see a tiny amount of variation in this bump texture. And that's it. That's how you create polished wood material using the car paint shader. Tip number 4. Do you hate UV layouts? Because I do. I really do. And I try to avoid it as much as I can. This tip here is about using VrayForC4D's TryPlanar shader in order to avoid having to create UVs. Alright, guys, I have to be honest, I probably oversold the TryPlanar method a little bit, but it definitely can solve some of the problems you might be having when you're not using UV layouts. Let me demonstrate. So usually you would have advanced material like this one, simple material, and you would slap it on your object, and then because you don't have some proper UVs, you would have to change the projection method to something like cubic. And of course, now when we render this, we see the problem that is always apparent here, and that is this nasty seam in the middle between the different projection directions. TryPlanar can fix this seam by a very simple trick, because it will blend the different projection sides with each other. So if I slap my TryPlanar example on here and render again, you can see immediately the seam is gone. Now, there's something that's still a problem, I think, in the cubic projection method, and that's the texture stretch that goes on in this border region. That's the region where the surface normal doesn't align with the direction of the projection, but the seam is gone. So if I go into TryPlanar mapping, I can show you how you can create your own by choosing V-Ray Bridge, Power Shaders, and then from this selection box, Effects, and then TryPlanar. Next step, you should decide whether you want to use different textures on each of the three axes. I usually use the same texture here. Then we will select our example texture here. Here we go, and that's basically it. I know that this example needs to be scaled up by reducing the scale value, a little bit counterintuitive, but that's how it works. And then we can render this and look what's happening right now. Okay, seam is gone, but what I don't like is that there's a large area that sort of is lacking contrast in a way. And that's because the blend amount is quite high. So what I can do, I can go into my TryPlanar and reduce this blend amount like I did here with the 0.1. And then when I render again, we don't have a large region where the contrast is lacking. So yeah, TryPlanar mapping is a good tool. It's very useful. It's great when you're lazy like me. I hope that this trick has helped you to improve your texture process a little bit, and let's move on to the next tip. And tip number 5, divide and conquer. When you work with a complex project with a lot of scene elements in it, your renders get usually slower, right? That's the natural go of things. So here is a tip that you can use to still maintain some degree of speed when adding new elements. Whenever I'm working on a complex scene, I create new scene elements outside in a new separate project file. And the reason for that is render times. I did that here, for example, with this shisha or hookah or whatever you may call it. And by leaving everything else away that is already part of the scene and concentrating on the detailing on just this element, I was able to tremendously speed up render times and concentrate on all the nice little detailing. And once I was happy with this result, I carried this object back into my master scene. But there are a couple of things you need to pay attention. The first one is scaling. Avoid having to rescale this new object in your master scene, because if you have to, your textures might look off. And the culprit for that is mostly noises, because noises oftentimes don't scale properly. So it's a good idea to really measure how large or how tall is your object, and will it have the right scaling in your final scene. The other thing that I didn't pay attention about too is that I didn't really carry over the lighting and the camera work that I have in my master scene. I just used some skylight or something, and I thought it looked great, but once I took this element over to my main scene, it didn't look right, and I had to retexture the object a little bit. So that's why I'm sharing this tip with you. And I think it's a better idea to actually go into your main scene, copy everything into a new file, and then remove everything that is unimportant for the object that you're working on. Here, for example, I was trying to look depth this smoke, and so I could leave everything away that is unimportant for this smoke. So I was able to focus my computer power just on the smoke and the objects that intersect with it. It works really well because once you're happy with this scene file and this object, you can take it back, and you don't even have to re-render the scene to see if it works, because it's all a copy of your main scene file, right? So yeah, I can highly recommend this approach, and just pay attention for the scaling and the lighting and the cameras. These three need to be identical, and then you're fine. So that's it, guys. 5 tips for V-Ray for Cinema 4D. I hope you've enjoyed it and there was something for you specifically in there that benefits your daily process. I want to make more of these videos in the future, so let me know in the comments if that's something you want to see more. And of course, I'd be happy to see your subscription to my YouTube channel as well. For now, that's it. I see you all again in the next video soon. Bye bye.